rationalism that can sometimes be presented when you're asking questions like, what about the explanation of the explanation of the explanation, or saying things like, you can't prove or verify everything. Well, that was the whole substance of what I was saying about critical rationalism. The first thing that it says is you can't just prove and verify stuff. That's not what rationality consists in. It's in laying bare your theories to criticism, not in trying to build up and support them. But anyway, I'll now come on to what you're desperate for me to do, and knock down those arguments for the existence of God that you've offered. And that is a valid part of this critical rationalist process. You know, just because one is saying that there's something invalid about arguing for stuff positively, doesn't mean there's anything methodologically wrong with trying to show why some of those arguments don't work. The first argument we offered was the argument from the origins of the universe, or the cosmological argument, as it's sometimes known. Now, I think that this is obviously it's an argument that gets offered a lot. Essentially, the problem with it is that it's not an argument, it's a paradox. It begins at the very beginning by saying you can't have cause. It says that, that the universe, it must be something that is caused, but you can't have an uncaused cause. It sets up a dilemma, two horns, that neither seems to make sense. You can't have an infinite regress where no cause is ever a cause, but also that the concept of an uncaused cause doesn't seem to make sense. A dilemma. And all the argument does in this case is opt for one of those things. It says, you can have an uncaused cause, it's got a name, and it's God, and problem solved. So I don't actually think it's an argument at all. It's a slippery move from setting up a paradox, a genuine and profound and difficult paradox, which says that, you know, our common way of understanding cause and effect either leads to an infinite regress, or leads to us from speculating about some kind of uncaused cause. But just to pick one of the horns of a paradoxical dilemma, give it a new name, and say that that's the answer, is not, I think, an argument. In this context, you also talked about the infinite, and quoted a philosopher saying that the infinite cannot have an ontological export. You quoted this approvingly, and I kind of agree. I think that there's a problem sort of taking a mathematical concept like infinity and applying it to anything that we think is real. You said that the infinite is never actualized and cannot be exported into the real, which kind of sounds to me like saying that anything that's supposed to have infinite attributes is unreal. And I kind of agree with that. I think that, you know, the common picture of the sort of theistic God that's painted says that some of its attributes are infinite, eternal, unending, unlimited, and so on. So I agree that it does make sense, that it's attempting to apply a sort of mathematical abstract notion to something and saying it's real, when in fact it's not. So we agree on that, but whereas you were trying to apply it to an infinite regress that I don't necessarily believe in, I'm saying that yes, apply it to God, and you'll see that's another argument against the existence of God. I think it's worth, as a side point, in the context of this cosmological argument, pointing out that the weirdness of it. Like, in a sense, the atheist only needs to say, yeah, this is weird, this is a paradox. I don't understand the concept of an uncaused cause, nor do I understand the concept of an infinite regress. Both options seem massively problematic. It's the theist, though, that comes along, picks one of those conclusions, calls it God, and says they've won the argument. That, to me, is the arrogant thing to do, whereas what we're often told is like scientists are arrogant, they're arrogantly messing around with the origin of the universe and so on. I think that, obviously, atheism there is the humble option that's saying, yeah, it's a problem, there's no good solution to this, it's a paradox, not an argument. You went on to the fine-tuning argument. This is the idea that the fundamental constants of the universe are balanced in such a way that life seems possible or inevitable, and that if they were balanced even slightly differently, then that wouldn't be the case. Again, I think it's strange that scientists and rationalists are often told you're being really arrogant about your science and your rationalism coming to all these conclusions. Well, no. Again, there's a weird thing here. We certainly don't know the answers. I certainly wouldn't want to say, oh, the answer must be that God magicked it all into place and function. I'm saying that the atheist option is not like there mustn't possibly be a God in any way, but it is saying, well, we don't know. You're right. This is a profound and bizarre mystery, and I'm not prepared to just magic a God up to solve it. There are possible solutions that people are beginning to talk about. There's no way I would actually plump for any of them and say, oh, this is going to be the solution. but they exist, people are thinking about it. So you have people like Lee Smolin, who has a cosmological hypothesis picture of the universe, in which the universe itself consists of multiple domains, not in that sort of quantum mechanics multiverse sense that you were talking about before, but in the sense that baby universes, this is why you don't want to plumb for it yet, it's a little unfinished as a theory, baby universes can fall off like fruit dropping off a tree at the point where singularities form, creates new universes with remelted laws of physics, so that you essentially get a sort of organic evolutionary process in universes where they become maximized to produce as many black holes as possible. They do that by producing first as many suns as possible. To do that, you have to have the same kind of fine-tuning system that we see. It has to be maximized to create big objects like suns, and that's why it shouldn't be any surprise after long enough of a universe producing and remelting the laws of physics that we would find that eventually it would be impossible not to end up in one of these universes. There would be so many that were maximized to create objects like suns and therefore planets and therefore people. That would explain the situation. Again, I'm not saying that's the case. It's obviously massively speculative. It sounds like something out of science fiction. But I do think that the sort of history of science leads us to think that that kind of explanation is probably more likely to be the case than that a magic force is responsible for having attuned the fundamental properties of the universe in the first place. It's highly subjective thing, it may sound like to say, but I think that if we look at the direction of science, it tends to go in the direction of favouring over time naturalistic theories that are eventually testable, than it's saying that the properties are configured by an invisible hand long before we were here in the first place. Come on to your final sort of argument or approach, which was you were asking what does it mean to exist. It was what you called your existential argument. It was about the sort of value and the moral purpose of people and the universe. You said we're not just robots. You said that without God there's no objective moral values, there's no ultimate meaning or purpose. You quoted someone and said, does it matter if we ever existed at all? You talked about Richard Dawkins and the selfish gene. I think what's really interesting about that kind of approach, the approach that says, and I think carefully about this notion, this premise, without God there is no meaning or purpose. What does a nihilist say? A nihilist, someone like the kind of thing that's attributed to Nietzsche, whether or not it's true. Someone who says, oh, life is pointless and meaningless. Well, that is also the first thing they say. They say, without God, there is no meaning, there is no purpose. The only difference between that type of religious approach and the approach of the nihilist is that one of them says, without God, life is meaningless, pointless, and without purpose, and there is a God. And one of them says, without a God, life is meaningless, pointless, and purposeless, and there is no God, or whichever one was the one I said. Both of them agree that the point of the universe, purposeness, morality, value, all of those things in some way depend on God. The religious person says there is one, the nihilist says there isn't. I think we have to recognise the proximity of those positions, how utterly close religiousness is, that kind of theistic religiousness that thinks that value is somehow imbued by God, and the nihilist is. It's the humanist who comes along with a really substantively different view and says, actually that's not God, it's not God that makes morality happen, it's the fact that there are moral agents in the world. It's the fact that there are things that count for and against our welfare, better or worse. It's that some things make us happier, some things make us sadder. And these are objective things. You said sort of without God there's no objectivity. Well, this is the objective world. This is where we are. If I get hurt, it's me as an object getting hurt, in the quoted sense, obviously. And there are real answers to those questions. If morality is not, as it is on the humanist model, something that subsists in the relationships between us, and because of the fact that I can do things that would hurt you, you can do things that would please me, things that would increase our welfare, our happiness, change civilization for better or worse. If that's not what makes morality possible, if that's not what morality consists in, I have no idea what it is that you think it does. That you take it outside of the world and say, oh, it depends on God and a metaphysical realm and another place and invisible castles in the sky. No, it's here. And surely if it's not that, it's irrelevant. It's not anything that means that human morality has to be about phantom metaphysical objects. That's what I find cold and very strange. Was that a minute to go?
No,
that was time. Okay.
It's gone a minute actually, but I'll let you finish your argument.
Okay. So just to wrap that up, I think it's the humanist morality that really gets more to the core of what we intuitively think of as morality in everyday life and we're considering how to make decisions. You mentioned things like Richard Dawkins' The Selfish Gene as a sort of counter-argument. Obviously, that book is not saying that the moral imperative is to spread your selfish genes. It's actually it's a book about how we have morality despite the selfish gene. It's an instruction to propagate to have as many partners as possible or anything like that. So thank you very much.
I let Bob go tonight because he wasn't looking at one, so I have to signal it. Okay, so we'll go to a little Q&A. So anybody wants to ask a question, please raise your hand, and then I'll just pick randomly. Literally. So everybody wants to ask something, just raise your hand right now, and then I can. Okay. That's it. Okay, well I'll go to the Muslim side.
And you just said that your morals are based on what makes you happy. So what if it makes me happy to steal or to kill or to do anything that's not morally correct?
I think the morality exists, as I said, in the sort of confluence of relationships around us. If you went around killing people, you'd be making a lot of other people very, very unhappy. So it's certainly complicated and confusing because it does mean, of course, that obviously what is not moral is the first thing that comes into my head to do because it's going to make me happy in a given moment. Clearly, morality, whenever we're faced with making a moral decision, is always complex. And I think that humanist way of thinking about it makes sense of that reality. It is complicated. Morality is really confusing. You can't read about it in a book. You have to live it. You can't derive from first principles. You can't deduce what it is by thinking about God. You have to get involved with people, understand what makes them tick, understand what we value, understand what contributes to our welfare, and then perform a really delicate, finely balanced negotiation between, sometimes, it's not always that complicated, but we have to think very hard about, okay, if I do this, it might make me happy right now, it's going to make them sad, it's going to make me feel worse in the future. It is complicated, but it doesn't obviously consist in just our first responsiveness.
Okay, can we both?
Yeah.
It's very quickly, I think this is quite interesting because I think Bob has made a cartoon of some of the arguments I portrayed, especially the moral argument. See, the argument here is I didn't say there was no morality. I said there's no objective morality, which means it exists outside of the mind. In a practical terms, it actually means that if I had a 3-year-old here and I put him through a mincemeat machine, that is wrong and it transcends our subjectivity. If people actually agreed it was right, like Saddam Hussein, he used to put babies through mincemeat machines when they were alive. That was Saddam Hussein, he was brutal that way, yeah? Is that objectively wrong? Because look, if we want to use reason and philosophy, then we need to be consistent rather than just say, it's because we're human, whatever that means. The point is, I agree. You don't have to be a believer to be good. But the point I'm trying to say is, in order to accept objective morals, then that necessitates God's existence because there is no other conceptual anchor that transcends human subjectivity and social pressure. Because if we do go down the route of the humanist route, that's a dangerous route. Because we have no reference point or anchor to tell us how do we prioritize our morals when we have dilemmas, for instance. Also, there's a problem because if it's based on what we believe subjectively to be what is human beings, and we have this kind of negotiation and we have this social pressure, then that could justify so many atrocities, logically, yeah? I'm not saying you're like that, no. But this is the problem of the humanists. For example, the philosopher from the British Humanist Association, Peter Cave, he says, you don't need God to be good. I agree. But to agree that morality is objective in that sense, that it transcends our human subjectivity, you necessitate his existence. And that's why Peter Cave, he would say, well, morality just is. But that's not an argument. That means Islam just is, and the Prophet Muhammad just is, and the Quran just is, and what we believe just is. And that's not a healthy way of discussing it. This is why I came back from Ireland recently, I had a debate with Professor Simons from Trinity College, and he said at the end, well, I agree. We have problems. The humanist worldview is problematic. Because one, we're assuming what it means to be a human being. Two, we're assuming that everyone's going to agree on the same type of social pressure that's not antithetical to our feeling. But that's not the case. We've seen that in history. We saw that in Nazi Germany. And I don't think
we come back quickly on that. I don't think we rely on any of this.
Let me finish it.
Sure, sorry.
Actually, go for it.
I don't think.
No meeting with the speakers. And secondly, one of the rules of debating, if debate society knows about this, no mention to Nancy Germany. That's one of the basic rules of debating, because it breaks all the arguments. Because it tends to then go too complicated, because Glenn Bacon is too much. So let's not go into this.
That's interesting. A free-thinking society is restricting my thinking.
No, it's the debate society is not a free-thinking society. It's a debating society. But
whatever that means.
Yeah. So do you want to finish? Do you want to finish your argument? Okay.
You said without God there's no book to hang morality on.
I didn't say that.
Okay. So you used the
I
word
said conceptual anchor.
Conceptual anchor.
Yeah. One by one.
No anchor to hang the morality. We're all anchors, and this is the humanist response to this idea that in a godless universe there's no value. It's not the humanist that says we're all free to do whatever we want. It's not the humanist that says, oh, I can't possibly conceive of why another person is valuable because there's no God. That's the nihilist and the nihilist religious that's saying that can't conceive of value without God. The anchors of people in the world, they don't need to be conceptual anchors. They're actual anchors of people with hearts and minds. And that, for me, and I think it's often the cause of most, I think, the disagreements between theists and atheists, between humanists and religious people, is that we just have a different way of thinking about morality. To me, yeah, it's real. It's an objective thing in the world. It's not arbitrary. It's not made up. It's made up in the sense that we use words and we think about it and we have to talk about it. But it's not therefore baseless. It has a much better base than sort of saying, well, I don't understand how a person is valued unless they were made in the image of God, or whatever it is that the conceptual book is supposed to be doing. I don't understand what function that book is supposed to be performing. It seems not to give value, but to rob value from the world, because it says, I don't get it. Where's the value without it? Well, what job is it doing? Yeah. What conceptual book? What does it give us that we don't already have from the fact that we have thought, feelings,
I agree with you.
lives to live?
But you have to understand what I'm saying. I'm not saying value here. I'm saying, look, we do have hearts. We're human beings. Even Islam appreciates that human beings can come to a certain sense of morality. We have this concept of the innate disposition, the fitra, the innate nature. See, I'm agreeing with you here. But let's take this discussion away from an emotive discussion and getting excited. Let's say, look, if we do claim they're objective in nature, though, you can't just bring them back to a subjective source. That's the problem. So you need to be consistent, logically, philosophically. Yeah? Now, if I had held your position, I would agree with you and say, yes, I want to believe morals are objective, but they're not. They are based on social pressure. They're based on what human beings feel, all individually, and that could be different, it could change. But I really want them to be objective. But because I believe in a conceptual anchor that if you study moral ontology basically, if you want to even believe or appreciate that morals have this objective sense that transcend human subjectivity, then
why does objectivity have to transcend the world? This is the world. It's an object with people, with things that are real and exist.
Yeah.
That is the objective.
But you just define morals
keep
as being
pulling it off
subjective,
saying that it needs to be objective. I think people are objective with things.
See, this is the point. I don't think an object like it's a physical being. Yeah? You are an object. Yeah. Because we don't.
But all objective means is something that is the case or not externally.
No.
Subjective.
See, that's why I
something
defined
like being happier or sadder. That's an actual question.
What I mean by objective is that that's why we can define our terms. What I mean by objective was, I gave the example of the 3-year-old with the mincemeat machine. That if people agreed with that, it would still be wrong. So it exists outside of the human mind. Yeah, that's my point.
Exactly.
What you're doing,
the fact that a person ends
one
up.
second, Bob. Yeah. What you're doing.
That's a fact.
Bob, let me build my argument. Yeah.
Yeah, this is Bob, 1 second. We're gonna try to respect each other, both of you, and not cut each other's whether in the middle of a sentence. No, I'm not saying you or you just in both. So you both know. So
okay, just fine.
Let's try to do a back and forth, but again respectively.
Yeah. See, my point is that I can see. What I'm saying, in accordance with my definition of objective morality, then we can't have it in absence of God, right? But your definition, you're bringing it back to subjective entities like human beings. That's the precise point. So if we all agree in one nation, for instance, let's be practical about this, because you said we need to have something empirical and practical. Let's make it work. In Greece, for example, I can marry a 12-year-old. If I take my wife as a 12-year-old to England, I'm a paedophile. For instance, if I bring her to Spain, I have to wait another year. So she's 13. If I go to America, God knows what's going to happen in 10 years there. There's some woman fighting, for instance, to marry her own son. You have, for instance, the workings of social pressure in Belgium. We have an organization called NAMBLA, the North American Men Lover Boys Association. They're using human rights legislation for old men to be able to sleep with like 6 and 7-year-olds, met boys. I'm not saying that's right or wrong. I don't want to pass a moral judgment. I don't want to caricature it either. But you're forcing me in that direction. You know, actually, listen to what I'm saying. What I'm saying is, if we do base it on social pressure, if we do base it on fellow feeling, as your comrade in arms, Peter Cave, philosopher Peter Cave, always talks about in his book Humanism, and he's the head of the philosophers group in the organization. He says it's just fellow feeling. Well, that's fine. See, I agree with that to a certain extent as well, right? Because there's some things that, you know, I just like know by fact, by innate disposition. But when we come to the other nuances, then we have a problematic world. And that's why I think, in a way, that conceptual anchor does render objective. If you take him out of the question, then an ontological basis of morality, you have two things: evolution and social pressure. Now, evolution can be an explanation for morality, and I agree, it can be, but it's not an objective explanation. It doesn't render morality objective, because what does evolution dictate from a moral perspective? That we're just products of a lengthy biological process. Our morals have evolved just like it is with tea. That's why philosopher of science Michael Rules, he says, when you say, you love thy neighbor as thyself, you think you're throwing above and beyond yourself, but it's not. It's just a random process. That's why Darwin, he indicated if we were to evolve like sharks, then it would be okay to rape women. That's what sharks do. So the point is, where's the value? Well, ontologically, there's no value. There's value subjectively. That's why we need to be consistent with our perspective. I agree, there is subjective value. So I'm not a nihilist from that perspective. Also, take social pressure. Well, anyone studying social constructionism, read the book by Vivian Bird. She wrote a book called Social Constructionism, okay? And if you read her works, you see that our morals and the way we behave as well is a product of our language. Even the meaning we put in morals and how we hook them and ground them is based on language. For example, take love as an example. If I were to say to you, Peter, I love you. Yeah? So say I love this geezer, right? You know, I'm describing an internal feeling, which that's what we've rendered love in the 21st century generally, yeah? That's why you see many women who get victims of domestic violence. We have 1 in 4 women are victims of domestic violence in this country. You know, and many of those men say, but I love her really. Yeah? It's an internal feeling. But if you go back to like 18th century, you see grandmothers, they'll be like, let me love you for a bit. Yeah? And it's a behavior. Because the way we put stuff towards language, or language shapes the way. So if that's the case, and if social pressures do this, and if you read the modernity thesis that, you know, collective consciousness change over a period of time, then we've got a huge problem. We've got a huge problem. That means we cannot objectively condemn things that happen that go against what we believe to be true now, because it's fluid. And I think that's the logical implication of what you're saying. And that's my point. So I'm not saying, you know, that religious nihilism. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying, if we do want to claim it's objective. So for me, I'll say that maybe it's subjective and real for you. But if we be philosophical about it, it could never be objective, because you haven't provided the ontological basis for objective morality. You said, oh, it's human beings again. Well, then you're going back to a relative subjective thing again. You see? That's my point.
I think we got your point.
Thank you.
To do a last rebuttal, and then we'll try to sort of alternate the last rebuttal, the next one. If you want to finish that. If you want to.
Very, very briefly, yeah, we obviously do disagree on what objective means. I think it's, just to give an example of, I think that if, for example, if you're playing a game of chess, it can reach a point where it might become impossible for either player to win or for a particular player to lose before anyone knows about it. That would then be a fact that sort of exists because of the rules of the game. It obviously in an abstractive sense, but it would become an objective fact about that abstract set of players before anyone knew about it. There's nothing to do with their subjective knowledge, their subjective opinion. It's outside. It doesn't have to be outside of the universe in order to be objective. It has to be in the universe in order to be objective. and then exist in that relationship. That's the kind of thing I mean by objective. That it just doesn't depend on my knowledge of it straight away. But something like, if we put a baby through a mangler, that's going to cause pain. That is an objective fact, just because it's here in the world. So we do have a disagreement, I think, about what objective means. You seem to think that pretty much nothing can be objective unless it's taken outside of the universe. I think it has to exist in the universe in order to be objective. Just briefly on Peter Cave, I think there's a thing we talk about fellow feeling, which obviously I think there's two different ways you can unpack that. There's fellow feeling as empathy, the thing that allows us to understand what's going to hurt other people or make other people feel better. Feeling that's a good thing between people. And there's fellow feeling in some sense of sort of social pressure, which you're turning into. I think obviously Peter Cave is talking about the former when he talks about basing moral calculations on fellow feeling. He's talking about accessing our empathy in order to understand other people and make decisions. He's obviously not saying that morality exists in whatever people say it is. A humanist or an atheist morality is not a relativist morality in which everything, in which nothing is right or wrong. It's right or wrong because of the impact it actually has on the real objective world.
Just a question relating to what we just talked about. We won't take too long, but now Sam Harris has written a book called The Moral Landscape, in which he argues that what we should say, the only thing, something is definite, the universe, like you could say, is definitely bad, is just imagine a universe where everyone suffers as much as they can for as long as they can, which hopefully everyone would agree would be very bad. And that an objective way, as it were, of looking at morality and of improving the world would be to move away from that, to make more people happy more of the time. And looking at it like that, these that then actually do have right and wrong answers to questions of, is this a good thing or a bad thing? For instance, it would be quite obvious that putting a baby through a mincemeat or whatever it was, it's not, it's not helping, it's not moving the world to a place where more people are happy. So I just what do you think about that argument? Or maybe I directed to you. But,
yeah, it's a nice argument.
Yeah, so just sort of it would provide somewhat to, as you said, anchor.
But this is different. See, we need to really understand what I'm saying. I know it's a bit complicated. My point is a moral ontological point. You brought up an epistemological point, moral epistemology, which is how do we get to know morals? Not the nature of morals, but how do we get to know them? That's a different discussion. So yeah, that's fine. If he thinks the way to get to know what morals are and what morals we should adhere to, then fine. He used a first basic principle and said, then, the greatest happiness for the most amount of people. That's what I'm assuming from your statement, which sounds like utilitarianism to me anyway. But the point is, that's a different discussion. It doesn't really undermine our discussion of what are morals. What you're talking about, how do we get to know what they are? It's an epistemological point. Our discussion was an ontological point. If we study moral theory or moral philosophy, we'll see there are two differences. So, yeah, I mean, even from an Islamic perspective, we'll say that's interesting. But we would then go to Revelation and say that's our source for how to get to know what morals are. We believe they're prioritized and they're being defined from that perspective. So it's useful, but it's not directly related philosophically to the topic. And he doesn't make a case for objective morals either. Anyway, he just makes a case of right. How can we start defining what those morals are? And to be honest, I haven't read the book, so I can't really make much judgment about it. So I'll read it. Thank you very much.
I think it is valid to talk about the moral epistemology of how we know. I'm not sure that is what you were saying. You were talking about what morality is, and about where. I think the reason that humanism is called humanism is because they're also the primary but not the only objects of moral thought. So rather than saying, as I believe that the theist tends to say, without God there's no purpose in the universe, humanists would say, without people to make moral decisions, there'd be no morality, no purpose in the universe. So how we know becomes a question of empathy, accessing what other people are thinking and feeling, and for society as a whole, what's going to make it better, what's going to make it worse. So how we know becomes, in one sense, very clear-cut, because it's objective, empirical investigation, as the time sometimes described, but one that is very complicated because the world is very, very messy. I think any attempt to say this is how we know, it's by referring to the principles about what God would want. That's taking things so far away from the human realm, the question of what is going to make us good and happy. In principle, it ends up with people delivering to us moral imperatives based on ideas like, this is what God wants you to do with your penis. That to me is the kind of result of taking away morality from people and giving it to God. It's that people then end up thinking in terms of what does God tell us to do, what does God want us to do, what does the universe dictate as a result of God's existence, rather than thinking, oh, actually, is that going to affect anyone in a good way or a bad way? Is there any moral principle that runs up against or not? And we overcomplicate and rob us of our value by referring constantly to God as if that's where it comes from.
No, the only thing is that if God says something about your penis, I'm sure it's going to be good for you. What's the big deal? I mean, from a metaphysical perspective, God knows Hamza better than Hamza does. So if he tells something to Hamza, then obviously it's going to be good for me because he knows me, right? But that's another debate. But the point is, you can't again you keep on making a cartoon out of my arguments. I mean, this is not Mickey Mouse. I'm not saying there's no purpose in life if you're an atheist. There's no ultimate purpose. Really, you did this with the cosmological argument. You said, well, the infinite doesn't exist, so therefore there must be uncaused or cause. That was a cartoon of the premises. When you knew the premises were whatever begins to exist as a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe is a cause. And then you just straight away just went to an older version of the cosmological argument and said, well, you've got a problem now because how could God be infinite except X, Y, Z? But that's not our issue. We're saying in the universe, the infinite doesn't exist, and it means the universe began to exist. It's not showing that there's a cause because infinity doesn't make sense. We're just showing the universe began to exist, and if it did, therefore it has a cause. And then you said you just squeeze God right in there. Again, you're not attentive to my argument. Many atheists do this. It's not uncommon. And it's true, because I've had so many debates like this, right? And they say, God of the gaps, there's a cause, and you just call him God. I specifically mentioned in my presentation, about 7.5 minutes into it, I said, we can't claim it's God. We can't claim it's Buddha or Jesus or Richard Dawkins there. You can't. I agree with you. I was with you there. And that's it. But upon conceptual analysis, we come to certain basic definitions that are in line with a monotheistic view on who God is. You missed that part out. I think that's a bit of a caricature of the first argument. And it's unfair to do that. I'm not saying you did it deliberately, but generally we should just be a bit more attentive to the discussion at hand. Okay?
Okay, I don't think that I radically altered the premises. There are lots of different ways of phrasing the cosmological argument. The most complex way...
You should phrase it the way I phrase it.
Was Aquinas' way of phrasing it in the first place. I mean, whether you say, as you said, anything that begins to exist has a cause, or whether you say everything that exists has a cause, yes, you're right, that's not the way it's a slightly different meaning, but the end result is still that you set up a dilemma with two horns. So if the two premises are something along the lines of everything that exists has a cause, or everything that begins to exist has a cause, on the one hand, and on the other hand, we can't just have a universe that's uncaused or an uncaused cause, whichever way you phrase it. If those are your two premises, and then your conclusion at the end, whatever process of conceptual analysis you've got to, if your conclusion at the end says there is an uncaused cause that is God, whatever conceptual analysis, however you've got there, well, that contradicts one of your first premises. If you start with two premises, there can't be an uncaused cause and there can't be an infinite regress, and then you say, oh, there is no cause, it's God. Those were the two premises, and that is the common problem with the cosmological argument, that it essentially ends up affirming what it denies in the first place. And any logical argument that ends up negating one of its first premises is obviously a reductio. You can then say, because I've deduced from my two premises something that then is the opposite of one of my two premises, I can now essentially reject one of those.
Okay, but this is what I'm saying. I really want to connect with you here. Of course, whatever begins to exist as a cause is fundamentally different whatever exists as a cause. Okay? So, whatever begins to exist as a cause, we say this is like almost undeniable. Yeah? Based on human experience, feeling, you know, how did that happen? It was caused, etc., etc. And I even gave a counter-argument, it was an atheist counter-argument about quantum theory, and I responded to that in the theistic way. So whatever begins to exist does have a cause. Then we said, right, the universe began to exist, and we suggested that's the case.
Just to check, that's a very solid premise that you've laid down there. Whatever begins to exist has a cause.
Okay, thank you. I love you, man.
So that's the first point. We're trying to understand
the second point is, the universe began to exist, and I brought some positive arguments for this by saying that the concept of the infinity doesn't exist in the real world, if we can't have an infinite history of past events. That was my point. Then I said, well, this also has happened to be justified. You could assume there's a justification from astrophysical evidence. I call it the hot standard model. I know if you study physics, there's many other models like the cyclic model, etc., etc., but they all have principles that render a beginning to the universe anyway, yeah? So there's a beginning to the universe. Okay, so there's two premises here. When we exist as a cause, the universe began to exist. So what logically follows, which makes it a sound and light argument, is that the universe had a cause. Now, upon conceptual analysis, we say, fine, this cause is more likely to be one, it's going to be uncaused, etc., etc. So I want you to show me where the paradox is. I don't get it.
I don't know, I think we're sort of going over the same...
No, that's tricky. You can tell me. You can tell me. I think the best thing to do is say, I don't know, I don't understand the argument. I think you made a claim here, isn't it? I just want to know how you justify your claim, because you made a mismatch of my argument, isn't it? And I've explained to you again nicely, and I want you to either say, I don't know, clarify it, or here's the answer.
I don't think that I'm being not nice or failing to understand. There are many ways of phrasing this argument. I think that this argument is showing is that clearly this tension that exists between these two possible options in terms of cause and effect of individual objects, the universe as a whole, is that probably there's something wrong with our whole notion of cause and effect, that we can set this paradox up so simply by just thinking in the common way that we use the terms cause and effect. I think that to talk about the entire universe in a way as necessarily needing to have a beginning and cause, and then analysing God in such a way that it's protected from exactly the same premises is what is slippery there. That's the point at which you sort of rename one horn of the dilemma as God.
No, see, this is the first premise. We're saying whatever begins to exist as a cause, that's the premise. You're still assuming...
Yes, but the implicit premise is then stuff like God doesn't have that God doesn't have a beginning, which on other versions we call cosmological argument.
But I didn't give you the other versions of the cosmological argument
because you didn't feel like that.
Because they're not strong. They're not strong arguments. And to show that this argument is a strong argument, you have to use outdated version of the cosmological argument to try and defeat this argument. I'm saying to you, why do you have to do that? We've got Microsoft. What's the new Microsoft now? 7. We've got Microsoft 7 here. Stop referring to Windows 98. I'm saying to you, let's stick to the argument here. The first premise. And you say no, but I want it to be that premise. Well, you can debate someone else if you want, but that's the argument I gave you, and therefore your paradox doesn't apply to this first argument. But yeah, we could. You know what? Actually, we agree. I agree. If the argument was like that, there was a paradox. I agree. If the conception of the cosmological argument was the version you gave, I agree with you. But it's not the version.
Whether or not you are thinking about beginning to exist, you're still relying on an implicit definition about God not needing to begin.
No, I didn't. I tell you why. Because I didn't even mention God when I did conceptual analysis. And if this cause is the cause of time and space, then we make some conclusions. I never said, it's God. Yeah! And it must have an cause because it's God. We define it that way. No. And then, see, this is what you have to understand. See, it's not, because I think you have a presupposition that it's God of the gaps. We just always want God to be there. But that's not the case. What you need to understand is, justify the cause for the universe. Then we said, right, let's think about this cause of time and space, therefore it could be this. Oh, some of the basic definitions are in line with the monotheistic version of God. So for us, we say, well, there's good reasons to believe in that. We're not saying it's blind faith, it's just a cause and we haven't thought about anything. No, there's a whole process of reasoning that we went through in order to say that we have good reasons to believe. You see, you're assuming that I'm always presupposing that God must be infinite, God must be eternal and uncause. No, I'm not. We're talking about specifically cause. You see,
I don't think I agree.
We can disagree on this.
Holding your hand for about half an hour.
Yeah, no, I know. I'm gonna do yes, from the faith.
Right. Can I begin by congratulating the atheist, secularist, and humanist society for putting on a debate like this of such quality. It really is. That was my next point. And then, of course, the speakers for the quality of what you've actually put forward. I would just, however, like to bring science into it. Can I say, first of all, that I have a great respect for Islamic science. Absolutely. They contributed so much a long time ago, and I hear just recently that the aim now of Islamic universities is to make them the best science universities in the world. I absolutely applaud that, and so should all of you. But, in between, there was a dip. There was some caliph, I believe, I do not know enough about Islamic history, and this isn't a talk about Islamic history. It is a talk about science, however. And I'm not going to question Hamza's appreciation of the concepts. All I'm going to say is that you actually need science. You need to face up to some of the abstract concepts which science brings, like infinity. Okay, you can dismiss it, you can ridicule it, you can dismiss it to nothing. You can say you're never going to think about it. Yes, you can say we're never going to get there. And for you, it doesn't really matter, does it? And yet, so many concepts have sprung out of science which are useful. How many of you remember first learning about negative numbers? I can certainly remember it, but I can't actually put a face to the teacher because I've had to go back to that time and think, I cannot see what negative numbers are about. I can see 2 apples, I can't see minus 2 apples. So that was a stage at which we went into the abstract. And you really do have to get into that stage in order to answer these problems. I'm going to ask whether you, if this is my question, do you appreciate that there's such a thing as real science? And most people haven't caught up with that yet. That looks at these problems, accepts things as they are. For example, you said freedom of expression is stopping me saying what I want to. I think it was your lack of science concepts that's not allowing you to say it properly. And
Is that a question?
science, that is not a criticism. Because lots of people are like this.
I've got thick skin.
Yeah.
I'm from Hackney.
Absolutely. And science does accept things. It has to. It's the way it works.
Yeah.
And it puts forward propositions which are not the absolute truth forever. They are not. It just will do until something else comes along.
Sure.
And a corollary of that is that there's no absolute truth.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah? No absolute truth. And we're quite happy with that. We're quite happy with our theories to be shot down in pieces.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
That's
because
what
it is the way that people work, that humans work, and get to an idea. The corollary of this is that you don't set out to prove something which you can't prove. Atheism is a negative word. You can't prove a negative. We don't waste time talking about negatives. Absolutely. We don't do that.
Sure.
Also, you said in one part that you can't see how nothing comes from nothing. Suddenly you've got two particles with nothing before it.
Sure.
Well, that is a holding statement. We don't know what was before it, but we're spending billions of pounds with a machine that hopefully in the next year is going to find out what came before it. And then we were spending even more billions on what came before that. Higgs boson does exist.
Yep.
That is the way it works, except the way that humans work.
Sure.
It is a frail human set of processes.
Yep.
And acceptance is an awful lot of it.
Yep.
I can't see that accepting a tree as beautiful is any less beautiful because there's a God. I can't.
Yep.
I can accept a tree as beautiful.
I agree.
So acceptance is a way of getting together. And just a final comment about both speakers. Again, it's not a criticism because you actually seem to be both philosophers, right? And philosophical arguments get into these tail things. And Bob was actually using quite a bit of science talk in his talk. I think he classifies himself as a philosopher, and good on him, all right? But you also talked about these circular arguments, which you get into, right?
You're doing very well.
And I don't think any of my arguments are circular. They are accepting anything that we've got and the processes that are going to get us forward. And talking to each other like this is one of the best ways of getting this forward. Thank you.
So basically, why don't you want to accept the principles of infinity?
No, I think it's a very, very good point, very good question, eloquently articulated done. I agree with everything he said, most of what he said. I totally agree that the Muslim world should start following its history, reviving its heritage. For example, Ibn Sina, an Arab scholar, he developed a book called The Canon of Medicine, which was used for 600 years in Europe. So, this is very important. When we go into Islamic Spain, we see the Colivencia, almost a foundation for European science, because we took the Greek stuff, we translated it, and we moved it forward. The reason for that, though, because I think there was a driving force behind that, because, Muslims believe in a book, and it's called the Quran, and we've got the reasons for that, and the Quran does say explore the universe, explore reality, and this is how we took the science methodology and we progressed with it. So I don't disagree with you, but what I would say is, I'm not denying infinity, of course not. What I'm saying is, we need to understand where certain concepts lead us, and where they can be used. For example, in the mathematical realm of discourse, if we look into the philosophy of maths, if you like, and how can we develop a concept such as infinity, it requires axioms and conventions. There's nothing wrong with that. I agree with that. If we don't have that, well, we're in trouble in the first place. It's practically impossible, yeah? But I'm saying you can't apply those concepts all the time to every single scenario, which includes the real practical world. That's what I was saying. It doesn't make me deny it in its context. Because I'm not even denying science in its context. I use science to help me justify my reasoning. For example, the fine-tuning of the universe, the constants, the initial conditions of the Big Bang, etc., etc. So I do have a very healthy appreciation of science. I think we need to move away from this kind of European-centric narrative in history where the Christian Catholic Church was dogmatically against science and progress. Islam never had that historical baggage, you see. So when I do speak, let's understand it from the Islamic historical perspective. We have a symbiosis, if you like, which is a scientific term, between the ruling class, if you like, the masses, and science itself, because there was no contradiction to Islamic thought. So all I'm saying is we need to understand even science itself as a particular methodology. Let's read about the philosophy of science. And what's quite amazing is more scientists now are reading about the philosophy of science and they're understanding that it's a methodology which is speculative. It's speculative in nature as well, and it has its scope. And that's why I use this presentation to educate all of us, including myself, on this matter, that science, scientific naturalism of science is not the only way to form conclusions about everything, particular things. So we use that, we take it on board, and we take other methods on board as well, and we come to conclusions about man, life, and the universe. So I agree with you. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, would it be in order to ask how many people here actually study science at the university?
It's most of them Muslim. The irony.
That's very, very satisfying.
But then people can have interest in science and then personally I have an interest in science and I study politics, so you don't necessarily have to be a science essentially educated in a university to actually have any knowledge of science. And certainly I do appreciate it very much. But do you have any comment?
No, I don't really think I have much to add to that. I think it's worth pointing out that I think from my perspective, as I sort of hinted during one part of the talk there, I think there is a general direction, and it's the kind of thing that sounds really subjective, but which fully agree. There is a direction and tone and flavour to the types of explanation that science ends up producing, partly down to the way the methodology is constructed, that we use the methodology because it works, and I think that it works partly because we do things like rule out from the outset supernatural and divine forces. We never tend to get to a point where we say, okay, the best scientific theory in this area at the moment is that a divine being is responsible, or a divine force is responsible, or a supernatural entity in some way. So I think there's a reason that science, it's not arbitrary that science has become closely associated with the secular and atheistic worldview. It's because there were problems before that God was trying to solve, which we found better ways of solving. Yes, you can, as was mentioned earlier, atheists often go, oh, you're using God as a stopgap. I don't think that's often said. I don't think it's an invalid criticism. It does seem to be the case that as we approach the world more, we answer more questions in more scientific and naturalistic ways and take ground away from the sort of religious area explanation.
I'm going to give the expression to the struggling man over there.
Finally, I just want to first and foremost obviously thank both sides for arranging this event and making it possible, and to the speakers for putting up such a great debate. My only question is, while I was listening to the debates, I was keeping a track on the time, and that made me ponder. It made me think the fact that those numbers didn't just come about by chance. There's some construction behind it. And I was trying to work out the probability of 1 to 12 coming in order, one after the other. And honestly, even with my mathematical knowledge, I couldn't find out. And I think the probability of that is very highly unlikely. So I was thinking, while I was thinking about that, the brother pointed out the science, and then it made me ponder the fact that, what about a DNA molecule? What about a DNA? What about a protein molecule? And the impossibility of that coming into existence, I can't remember what the actual probability behind it is, but it's almost near enough impossible. So how is it that basically on one hand, we agree the fact that this watch has got a creator, it's got a designer, it's got some kind of manufacturer, there's something behind it, there's some intelligence behind it, but yet there's all of us standing and sitting there, myself standing, all of us, and even just basically a DNA molecule or basically a protein molecule that probably isn't visible to a naked eye, how can we say that in all its complexity just came about by chance? If we can't explain just a simple DNA or protein molecule, how can we then basically say that all this world and the way it's all orchestrated and it's in perfect harmony, how can we say that came into existence? That's my question to Bob.
The clock, as the Halley's pocket watch, which was the sort of original form of the first time clocks being used as a design.
Now, can you use another example by all means?
It's a clock, okay. A timepiece, like the one that you pointed out, it's designed with good reason to think that it's designed, and you may know the designer or design. It doesn't follow from the fact that some objects with the appearance of design are designed, that all objects with the appearance of design were designed by a designer, any more than it follows from the fact that some objects appear to be owned. So, for example, there's a sign outside the building and it says this property is owned by such and such. The other objects that appear to be owned have a fence around them. It doesn't necessarily mean that they are. But we have incomplete but good picture of how organic developed in the world, and it's just a different type of object. You could look at the whole system of the Earth in space and say, oh, this is pretty good. It appears to be the case that there's an Earth going around a planet and revolving, and there's a sun, and that creates daytime and nighttime. This looks like an amazingly designed object. It stops the planet from heating up too much, because if we were just facing the sun all the time, we'd get too hot and burn. If it was the other way, we'd get too cold and die. So you could look at that system and go, oh, it looks designed, but obviously we would know, no, we're wrong. It's not the right kind of thing to talk about as being designed, even though it could superficially have that appearance. So yes, genes superficially might have the appearance of being designed just like the way the Earth spins, but that doesn't make it so. We have better understanding, better explanation of how that came to be than that it had a grand design.
I don't know, the only problem that I'm having with that is basically, okay, just to shed a light, make it easy. Say, for example, someone wrote that title, it's only 2 lines, but if we just basically got, a paint or just ink together and just throw it on the board and then expected all of that come into existence, it kind of, if one was to ask, how did that come about, you wouldn't agree with the fact that, you could just throw all of that ink together or paint together and it just comes about, with a nice little title. Or, so if we can't explain 2 lines, how can we explain, say, for example, the complexity of the DNA, which, has so much information that, the human mind can't comprehend to it? How do we explain that,
It didn't happen by throwing something at a wall. How did the complexity... Sorry.
Yeah, the basic argument here that the complexity of the universe, the sheer beauty of what it is.
Basically, all I want is, if Bob agrees with me, the fact that basically by throwing paint on the whiteboard or on the wall, we would get a nice little title there, and basically, if that could happen, if he agrees with me on that basis, then I have no problem in accepting, the title that we have today.
Yeah, I think we understand the...
If we took a whole bunch of random proteins and molecules and liquid and pushed them together in a bucket, then obviously we would both agree that would be a similar situation, and we would not expect a complex result. But obviously, evolution by natural selection is giving us a theory that does explain how it's nothing as similar as throwing stuff at a wall. That's something you do one time, maybe with a bucket of ink or something. Evolution by natural selection is a process taking place over a very long time, in which initially stable compounds are being broken down into protein molecules that have a very, very long time in which to form very, very simple systems, which slowly, in some way that we don't fully understand, like right back to the moment of biogenesis, but evolved and replicated. So I don't see the comparison at all between throwing ink at a wall and having a planet that's sitting there billions of years on which process of evolution.
Just to demystify a bit, I think I agree with